is Matthew Parrish. I work at the Whitehall Historic Site located in Richmond, Kentucky. And I'm doing another video that's going to talk about some amazing artifacts that we have on display here at Whitehall. All these artifacts that you see in front of me here either belong to or were used by enslaved people. So this video is going to talk about some history of slavery in Kentucky and go into detail about some individual people that we actually know about from records that we have. So to get started here, I'm going to talk a little bit about how slavery comes to Kentucky. In the 1770s, a lot of colonists are coming west from places like Pennsylvania and Virginia and the Carolinas into Kentucky, which at that point in the 1770s was basically considered by colonists frontier territory that was claimed by Virginia. Kentucky eventually becomes a state in 1792. But before that, a lot of people from Virginia were coming west into Kentucky. There were a lot of tobacco and tobacco plantations and a lot of slave owners in Virginia. And so when people start coming west, enslaved people are being brought west to Kentucky as well. One of these Virginians that comes west is a man by the name of Green Clay, who would go on to be the father of Cassius Clay, who lived here at Whitehall. And Green Clay is actually the reason why Whitehall is even here. So Green left Virginia around 1780. He became a very successful land speculator. In 1782, Green Clay surveyed land here and as payment kept about 1,000 acres of it for himself. Massive amount of land. And then in 1785, just a couple of years later, he actually purchased even more land, 1,200 acres. So by 1785, Green Clay owns this massive estate, 2,200 acres of land. A brick home was built. It's completed in 1799, and it was actually originally called Claremont. And part of Claremont is basically what makes up Whitehall. I'm sitting in a room that would have been the original Claremont house. Claremont was a pretty large farming house. It was about 8 or 9 rooms and 2 stories. It was given to Cassius Clay, Green Clay's youngest son, when Green Clay died in 1828. And Cassius Clay added on to Claremont later on in the 1860s, making it a much, much bigger house. So Green Clay was one of the wealthiest men in Kentucky at his time. He owned thousands of acres of land across the state. He owned several businesses like a tavern and a whiskey distillery, several ferries along the Kentucky River. And as his wealth grows, you see that the number of enslaved people that he owned continues to grow as well. In 1810, we actually have a census record from Green Clay, and it lists him as owning 70 enslaved people. By the time that Green Clay died in 1828, he owned over 100 enslaved people. They're all listed in his will. So, due to the nature of slavery, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of artifacts that would have belonged to enslaved people. A lot of the things that they would have had, including their clothes and pieces of furniture, would have been things basically issued to them by their enslavers. However, we are lucky enough to have some original pieces here that we believe would have been used or owned by enslaved people. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is this really amazing piece of woven cloth here. It is said that it was made by an enslaved woman here at Whitehall. It is made out of wool and it's dyed with natural dyes. I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that this very deep orange color actually comes from the Osage orange tree. The wood inside the tree, especially the heartwood, is a very sort of deep orange color, and it's often used for making for dyeing things like wool. And it is interesting to note that there are actually Osage orange trees that grow here on the property. So just one piece of evidence that shows most likely this is the real thing. So this artifact shows that textiles were being made by enslaved people on the property. We also have documentation to prove this. In Cassius Clay's memoir that he wrote in the 1880s, he notes that his father did own sheep and thread was being produced on the property. We also, this is a really important thing, have a business agreement from 1810, which talks about an enslaved woman named Hannah making wool yarn or thread here on the property. The business agreement was an agreement made between Green Clay and a man named Martin Sparks, talking about different businesses that they're going to be owning jointly, and also enslaved people that they are owning jointly and that are making things and producing things. So here it actually talks about this enslaved woman named Hannah and what she is doing. And I'm going to quote it directly here. It says, Hannah is to cook for the slaves and milk, and what time Hannah has to spare over cooking and milking, she is to spin 1 pound for Sparks and 6 for Clay. So there it actually talks about this enslaved woman named Hannah that was enslaved by Green Clay spinning wool yarn or thread. So this just shows not only were textiles like this produced on the property, but it also shows you how hard life was for enslaved people like Hannah. The amount of work that's being done every day. She is cooking for other enslaved people throughout the day. She's also milking cows. And it says whatever time she has to spare, she is to be spinning wool yarn and is supposed to make about 6 pounds of it per day. Pretty amazing. So some other items that I've got here are these 2 very small beads. I'll be sure to show sort of a close-up picture of them because one of them has some pretty interesting detail work. The larger one is sort of a glass bead, and the very small one is a clay bead. So oftentimes beads like these are found at sites where enslaved people would have been living. And these 2 beads were actually found by archaeologists here on the property. So we know for 100% these came from Whitehall. And they most likely belong to an enslaved woman on the property. Like I mentioned earlier, clothes that were being worn by enslaved people were often clothes that were being issued to them by their enslavers. And so a lot of the times the clothes were quite plain and didn't really have a whole lot of detail to them. It didn't look very nice. So beads like these would often either be made by or purchased or traded for by enslaved women so they could use them for decoration. Sometimes enslaved women would have them in their hair. Sometimes they would make them into jewelry using beads to make things like necklaces and earrings and bracelets. So it's really amazing to see this culture that was amongst enslaved people. Although they're being issued this very plain, what was oftentimes called just slave cloth to use for making clothes, they would decorate their clothes and their hair and themselves whenever they could. They would often use things like these beads and also natural dyes, like what was used for this piece of textile here. So life for enslaved women, like Hannah, was not easy, and you see this especially in a court case that involves another enslaved woman named Mary, who was enslaved by Green Clay. So Mary was a young enslaved woman, and she, in 1820, was sent by Green Clay to another nearby estate to work and labor. The overseer of this estate, according to this court case, would yell at and abuse Mary. And at one point, Mary actually argues back to this overseer. argues with him. The family and the overseer decided to punish Mary for this. They locked her in a room, and according to the court case, actually planned on killing her. But Mary had suspected something was wrong and apparently hid a knife that she had acquired in her dress. When the overseer came in, he attacked Mary. Mary actually defended herself, ended up killing this overseer, and then fled and came back to the Clay's estate. Cassius Clay, who was only about 9 or 10 years old when this happens, actually remembers seeing Mary coming back to the house after this attack. And he writes about it in his memoir. I'm quoting him directly here. This is from his memoir. He says, I heard a scream, and looking up, what was my horror to see Mary coming into the yard with a butcher's knife and her clothes all bloody. All of the servants from every cabin, big and little, ran wildly around in tears with exclamations of grief and terror. Their exclamations of grief and terror were most likely for good reason, because of what happens next to Mary. She was soon arrested. She was found guilty of murder. She was imprisoned in basically a jail in Lexington, Kentucky, and was sentenced to be executed. However, this event gets quite strange with what happens next. The governor of Kentucky actually pardoned Mary on the eve of her execution. There's no real reason that is specifically given to why the governor did this. Perhaps he sympathized with Mary and perhaps could tell that it was a case of self-defense. But there's also a pretty good possibility that Green Clay used his influence and his wealth and his power to have Mary freed. Because Green Clay at this time, he had been a politician in Kentucky. He was incredibly wealthy. Maybe he paid for Mary to be freed. We're not entirely sure. However, it is important to note that after Mary is brought from that jail in Lexington back here to Claremont, she does not stay. In 1828, when Green Clay passed away, he instructed in his will that Mary was to be sold out of the state. And Cassius Clay actually remembers seeing Mary being taken away from the property after Green Clay had died. So these last items that I have here in front of me are these pieces here were actually found also by people doing archaeology on the property. There are a couple of iron nails here and an iron buckle as well. These items were most likely used by enslaved people, enslaved men working on the property. Labor done by enslaved men, all enslaved people, but enslaved men would have been basically the source of much of the Clay family's wealth. We know the names of a lot of enslaved men that would have been here at Whitehall, but we don't really know a whole lot about their lives, except one man named Jack. And the only reason we know a little bit more information about Jack is because he is involved in a court case as well. Along with this court case, there were a couple of Clay family documents that came before the court case that talk about Jack, and in all of them, they're talking about him fixing things and building things on the property. So these nails here, this buckle, which was probably used, in a harness for a draft animal like a mule or an ox, would have been being used by an enslaved man like Jack. So this court case. In 1848, there is an event that happens that's basically described as a mass escape effort by a large group of enslaved people that come from different plantations and estates around the area of central Kentucky. Basically what happened was this group of enslaved people, they are able to get away from the place that they were enslaved, and they meet near Lexington, and a group of about 75 men, women, and children then make their way north. Their goal was to cross the Ohio River into Ohio to seek their freedom. They do not get to Ohio. So what happens is this group, they get almost to the river. They're in Bracken County, Kentucky, and they were stopped by a group of essentially militia Kentucky men who had figured out what was happening and went to try to stop them. There was actually a fight. There was a gunfight that breaks out, and after this fight is over, these enslaved people are captured. Some people are able to escape and get away, not necessarily to Ohio, but to avoid being captured. But Jack is captured in this group. Before I continue on, this is a really interesting case because the date is really important. 1848. Green Clay had died 20 years before this. He had given his youngest son, Cassius Clay, enslaved people to own. Cassius Clay does emancipate some of them in the 1840s. He had gone to Yale. He had gone to a talk given by an abolitionist, and Cassius Clay had become an anti-slavery politician and an anti-slavery advocate. But despite being an anti-slavery advocate and sort of emancipating some of these enslaved people, it's clear that through this court case that Jack, it says, was an enslaved man enslaved by Cassius Clay. So despite being an anti-slavery politician and advocate, Cassius Clay still owned slaves. We even actually see it before this 1848 sort of event. In 1840, there's a federal census that happens, and according to the census records, Cassius Clay owned 13 slaves. So I just wanted to point that out. It's really strange that Cassius Clay was an anti-slavery advocate, advocated for slavery's end, but still owned slaves, and by 1848 owned this enslaved man named Jack. Just wanted to point that out. So back to the court case. Jack was captured. He was put in jail. There is a trial that happens with him and all the other enslaved people that had been jailed. And Jack and a number of other men were specifically arrested for, and I'm quoting here, willfully and maliciously intending to kill. And it noted that Jack and several other enslaved men were armed with pistols. Jack was not executed. He was actually able to leave the prison after the trial was over. We can only assume that he came back here to Whitehall. Unfortunately, we don't really know a whole lot about Jack and what happens after this court case. But this is just an amazing event that shows that at least 75 people were willing to go to the extent of risking their lives to get to Ohio to escape slavery here in Kentucky. So although we cannot pinpoint specifically who these items belong to, they're just amazing pieces that show what life would have been like for enslaved people. There would have been a lot of work involved in life for enslaved people. They would have been laboring for their enslavers. They would have been producing textiles. They would have been working in different shops, and they would have been building things on properties. But they also had some things that allowed them to have their own culture. I mean, things like these beads and this piece of woven cloth. They would have been dyeing their own pieces of cloth. They would have been using beads to make their own jewelry. So really amazing to see what life was like for enslaved people in early Kentucky from these really interesting pieces here. So I thank you for watching this video. There are going to be more like it coming. So be sure to like and follow the Whitehall Historic Site YouTube page. And if you want to see these items for yourself in person and a lot of other really amazing items here, be sure to come stop by Whitehall Historic Site in Richmond, Kentucky.